Hazel will now share with us our reading.
The Gospel reading is taken from John chapter 6, verses 1 to 21, and that's on page 1069 of the Church Bibles. Jesus feeds the 5,000. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with the 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ.
Thank you, Hazel. So here begins the beautiful story of the feeding of the 5,000. It's a story that is common to all of us. I'm sure it's one that I heard very early on in Sunday school, which is told by all 4 of the evangelists. And this is the only event from the earthly ministry of Jesus told in all 4 Gospels. It shows what God can do with very little. First, we must recognize what we have available to us. We take inventory of what we have before we can do anything. We must take inventory. We must know what we have. So, like the widow that we heard about in 2 Kings, she needed a miracle to get out of debt. And the first requirement was to take inventory. What do you have in your house? And we have had a lot of great things in the past, but what do we have now? What I used to have doesn't help anybody. It's what I have now that can be used for the master's service. Now the widow had very little. She had a pot of oil in that story we heard in 2 Kings. But it wasn't enough. She was in debt and she cried out to God. She was told by a religious man to go and find some empty jars, of which she did. She located a whole set of empty jars. And she was told to just pour that oil, keep filling those jars. And that oil, God provided the oil, and that oil just kept flowing and flowing. And he provided for her. Now there's things on social media that go around, and there's been messages that I have heard. And one of them really stuck with me, is that it's not how many cars you have, it's how many people you gave a ride. It's not how big your house is, it's how many people you invited in. It's not how much food you have, but how many people you have fed. So, for this story we heard this morning, it is very much about taking inventory about what we have and what God can do with the little that we have. The disciples reported, "There is a lad here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes." This is where the miracle starts, with what we have, no matter how small or how little it is. All God requires is for us to take what we have and give it to him. It's not our responsibility to make the bread or multiply the fish. We are asked to bring it to Jesus. And often we might feel like Philip did. There's not enough money to provide enough bread. Or like Andrew, who said, "What are 2 fish and 5 barley loaves among so many?" If we are not careful, we can allow the immensity of the task to keep us from doing anything whatsoever. Now, this pandemic has paralyzed some people, and if we become paralyzed, we will misuse the opportunities we have, misuse the resources we have, and sit in inactivity. There was a time I used to coach a netball team, and for many years, I coached them for about 2 or 3 years, and it got to the point where I wanted to stop coaching the team and to dedicate more time to church and my ministry and what I was doing. But I prayed and asked the Lord, and I felt as though I needed to carry on. And what the Lord showed me was the ministry that I had within the coaching. A lot of the women that played the netball, that was their only source of me time they had with themselves. And what I didn't realize is, after the practice sessions or after the matches, I would have conversations with a few of them, and at that time share my love of Jesus and share how God has worked in my life and able to help them in that way. And I didn't realize that there was a ministry within the netball that I was coaching. And God showed me that how he could use the different gifts and talents that he's given us for the kingdom. And today that really reiterated within the story about taking inventory about what God has provided us, the little that we have. It's not us that's going to multiply. God will use that for his kingdom. So that is just an encouragement for us all this morning. May we, as we transition out of this pandemic, out of the lockdown that we have been, may we take inventory about all that we have learned, all that we have experienced from it, and how we can use it going forward, giving it to Jesus, just as the little boy provided his 2 loaves and fishes and gave it to Jesus. May we give it to Jesus and allow him to show us how he will use it for his kingdom. Amen.